7:20, and they're tasked with helping rehabilitate individuals ready for a return to society. But a new report has found that young offenders institutions are failing those within their care.
Declining standards of education, staffing problems and long periods of solitary confinement are just some of the issues raised following a review into the system across England. Nick Johnson reports.
Wetherby Young Offenders Institution in North Yorkshire. Behind these walls, space for around 300 boys between the ages of 15 and 18. This is one of a handful of such prisons for young men in England and Wales who are jailed at an age where effective and lasting rehabilitation is key. But a joint review of 5 young offenders institutions by Ofsted and the prisons inspector over the past decade has found inmates are spending very little time in the classroom. And because of the need to keep some boys apart, most of their days alone in their cells.
Children should have as close to a full-time education as possible, ideally at least 15 hours. But in the worst case example, we've seen children who have been locked up for the best part of 23 hours in one day and only get 1 hour or less than 1 hour out of their cell. And too often my staff need counselling when they leave because what they see is so upsetting.
This is Feltham Young Offenders Institution in West London, chastised previously for its high levels of violence and poor conditions. And this report adds to those criticisms. Ofsted says when young boys eventually do get into prison classrooms here and at other institutions, the standard of learning is poor. It says some prisoners who can't read are expected to sit GCSE papers, while high achievers are given activities such as word searches and colouring in. His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons says more than 60% of children reoffend within a year of their release. An enormous cost to the taxpayer, but also to their communities and families.
It is absolutely incumbent on our YOI system to reduce that reoffending rate. And one of the critical ways of doing that is to make sure that children are getting a proper, decent education.
Lorenzo Alara was 19 when he was jailed at a young offenders facility for drugs offences. He wasn't held at one of the institutions highlighted in the Ofsted report, but says lacklustre education for young prisoners is systemic.
When I went there, there was a music course that I wanted to do. I wanted to do this music course, but there was no teacher for the music at the time. So then I was like, oh, so I didn't really want to do anything else. So I just kind of you get what I mean? Like some guys didn't go to school, some guys didn't like school. But if you can teach them things that they're actually passionate about, then I can put them on the right path to work, you know?
So the system needs to be more adaptable to the needs and interests of the prisoners.
Yeah. And it just needs to be more engaging because it just feels like brainwash sometimes. It just feels like you're going there to pass the time. You don't really care about what you're doing. Then you go back. Do you get what I mean? So yeah, it doesn't feel. I didn't feel educated.
Ofsted and the prisons inspector say appropriately qualified and competent teaching staff should be recruited. Young offenders' attendance at education should be prioritised, and the amount of time kept in isolation should be significantly reduced, all to put a stop to the endless cycle of reoffending. The Ministry of Justice says the government has inherited a criminal justice system in crisis and is determined to tackle these challenges head-on. Nick Johnson, BBC News.
Let's talk about this some more, shall we? Because Tyr Blundell joins us. He's a trustee at the charity Band of Brothers and works with those living in young offenders institutions. Hi, Tyr. Good to see you. And for you, this is personal, isn't it? Just explain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, once upon a time, I was excluded from school. And when I went to a pupil referral unit, things were very different there. It was quite a violent environment. And actually, I had to meet that as well. I had to just to survive. And that's the situation for many young people in young offenders institutes when they go there as a byproduct of exclusion. 85% of young people in young offenders institutes were excluded from school. So it just moves along. And so when they get there, things are mirrored in a sense of what they experienced at exclusion and in pupil referral units, with not getting the education that they can achieve just because they've been excluded for behaviour, which might be to do with neurodiversity or issues at home, such as trauma. Doesn't mean that their academic ability is any less. I proved that. I went to the University of Oxford. So it's not to do with behaviour is not necessarily linked with academic ability. But too often in these institutions, they're not able to reach their potential by doing the subjects and the studies that they want to do. And the report clearly shows that.
So how long on are we from your exclusion? And when you read this report that's now, presumably you were shocked that it was mirroring your experience all these years on.
Well, yeah, I was shocked, but not really surprised. I mean, it's really interesting how it's almost mirrored at both ends, the kind of experience in the Young Offenders Institute. You know, there's what really strikes me in the report is that, you know, that their voices are not in there. I mean, I think that's really shocking. It's a 10-year report and not a single voice is in there about how they experience this, what they need, what their frustrations are. And there's some really shocking stats in there. Only 34% feel that there's a member of staff that actually cares for them. Gosh. And these are people that will have had traumatic things happen in their life. At a Band of Brothers, we help young men who are in the criminal justice system, and many of those have been to Young Offenders Institutes. And at the source of every one of those young people is a trauma that they experienced early on in their life. And it's shocking that there's no mental health support. It's not mentioned in the report. It's not mentioned when you go on a website to look at Young Offenders Institute. It's mentioned as part of an induction alongside well-being and sexual health. And it said that the induction will last about a week. I mean, what is about a week? What does that mean? That's the only support they get. And as the report says, locked up for 23.5 hours a day. That's not going to be good for anyone's mental health. So is it any surprise that there's violence happening in there and a lack of engagement with education itself?
We heard from Lorenzo in that report who said, I wanted to learn about music. There were specific courses that I would have engaged with, but there wasn't a range of things on offer for me. And so I left feeling like I hadn't been educated at all. Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much talent within these young people, but it isn't harnessed. And often they're trying to put a round peg into a square hole. And it's a shame because actually it's a minimum of £100,000 to send a young person to a youth offenders institute. You've got to ask, where's that money being spent when, as the report says, on a barista course, they didn't have a working coffee machine? So what's going on with that money? There isn't the staff there, but there's certainly the money flowing. So I'll be really interested to know how it's being spent, because it feels like there's no excuses for the things in this report. There's no excuses to give the young people for how they're being failed here. For people who are watching this morning who say, OK, I hear you, but some of these young people have done terrible things and they're there to be punished, what do you say? Sure. But where's the punishment leading us, and how much are we willing to pay for punishment? It's £100,000 to send them there. Then they keep reoffending. Then they go to prison. Then it's maybe a little bit less, but it's about 60,000. And then they're reoffending there and going back. So how much are we willing to spend on that? These are children. Yes, they need to be accountable. And yes, they need challenge. But we also need to address the challenges that they face, which have led them into these offending behaviours. They don't happen in a vacuum. We need to kind of zoom out and look at what's going on around them and address those issues so that they can then contribute to society and turn their lives around. And finally, quickly, can you remember the moment or the person that helped you to do just that? The truth is, there wasn't really a person, but for me, I got into martial arts, and that gave me some respect. The coaches respected me, and I was respected. My differences were actually harnessed and used in positive ways. And the expectation of me was that I could achieve greatness. And, you know, at the very top of the report, it says here that senior leaders in Young Offenders Institutes lack ambition for the people there. That's going to be infectious, and they're going to lack ambitions for themselves, like I did before martial arts. I had low self-esteem. I didn't do anything with my life. And that's what we're seeing here. And that's what needs to change. Someone believing in you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for coming in and sharing your story. Thank you. Really interesting. Thanks. It's coming up to our